What's the scariest story you heard a child tell about their imaginary friend? My oldest, when she was 4, she had an imaginary friend named Jack who lived under our back porch, and he liked to shove sticks down people's throats. I discouraged playtime with Jack. My son was 2 to 3 and always had a bunch of imaginary friends. The most frequently mentioned were Monkey Boy and the Cowboy. When my son was 2, he woke up one night screaming. I ran in his room, and he was terrified. He kept pointing at the corner and saying that Monkey Boy was bad. I ended up picking my son up and putting him in bed to sleep with me. The next time he was 3, and we were taking a walk with his younger sister in the stroller. I'm pushing the stroller and he's walking just behind me. He keeps saying, "Oh, stop it," or "Please stop." I keep looking behind me at him and see nothing. I stop and ask him what's hurting him. He says, "The cowboy is hurting me, mommy." I tell him that there is no cowboy by us. He says, "Yes there is. It's the cowboy in my head. Kids are creepy sometimes." My cousin was a few years younger than me, and he had an imaginary friend called Mookie. Mookie wasn't human, but some kind of alien/monster thing. Used to freak me out when I'd hear a noise behind me at my grandparents' house, and my cousin would calmly say, "It's only Mookie. He just wants to see you." Apostrophe. My son had this imaginary friend, Ganga. She lived in the nearby pond. Had duck feet, hair all over her face, ate through a slit in her neck, and we were expecting her any minute for dinner. He was totally chill with this horrific monster idea. Yet he had recurring nightmares about a puppy coming into his room. Kids are weird. My youngest niece had an imaginary friend, and when my sister told me about it, she said, "Ask her what she looks like." Okay. What's she look like? Broken pieces. Oh. Why she broken, sweetie? She fell from our tree. Nope. Sorry sis, you're on your own. When my daughter was a toddler, she randomly started talking about a man named Don. She always described him the same way and didn't seem scared at all. Despite bringing him up every day, she didn't go to daycare, and we didn't know anyone named Don. Then one day she got completely freaked out. Wouldn't walk around the house alone in case she ran into Don. Wouldn't sleep in her own room. And would talk about how she hated him because he said mean words to her all the time. About a year into Mean Don, we bought a new house. Once we moved, she never spoke of him again. So maybe not scary, but definitely weird. When I was little, I claimed to have an imaginary friend who had light brown hair and wore a nightgown, and she had stars for eyes. Well, my niece was living at my old childhood home, and she told me that she has a friend who misses me, and she asked why I went away. When I asked who, she described my old imaginary friend. It was super spooky. Edit. I have been informed that this is scary. My apologies. Bro. Me. His name was Ricky. He lived in the mirrors and wouldn't let me change. I vividly remember saying something along the lines of, "Ricky, please don't watch me while I'm changing. Ricky, go to a different mirror. I have to take a bath." Like, what? My cousin had an imaginary friend who she said used to live in the fireplace and was red and patchy, as if she was burnt. Apparently she was a little girl who wore funny clothes that looked like olden day clothes. Still spooks me out. A kid said he didn't want to go to church because my invisible friend says he can't follow me in there. I'm talking to Mies. Lady. Who's Mies? Lady. The white lady with black eyes and long fingernails. Cue me searching for the nearest exorcist. My friend's kids used to wake up at night and tell us there is an old lady in their bedroom. Effing best not be. My son stopped talking to his imaginary friend for months after my nephew, who was 15, took his own life. My son, who was not quite 5, was the apple of his eye. My nephew treated my son like a little brother, and since his mom watched my son while I worked, they spent tons of time together. I had simply told my son his cousin was sick from sadness and he'd died. I would remind him every time before we went to their house, so he wouldn't pester my sister about where he was. One day he said, "Mom, you keep saying he's not here anymore, but he is. He sits on my bed before I go to sleep and talks to me. He would not be dissuaded." This went on for months. He knew things we did not speak about around him that happened. My nephew's grandpa on his dad's side passed a few months later. That's when my son told me his cousin told him he wouldn't be able to visit anymore. He was going on a train with his grandpa, and they couldn't come back again. Last thing he told him was to never play with guns. They weren't safe. My nephew took his life with a handgun. Wigged me the hell out. My youngest sister, 4 at the time, had an imaginary friend named Paris Jeris. My dad had built her a small playhouse in our backyard where my mom could see and hear her while she was in the kitchen. My sister would have tea parties and such with her imaginary friend. One day mom heard her say, "Don't worry, as long as I'm alive they won't hurt you." She paused and said, "Well, if you do that then I can't help you. It's not nice to kill people." When my mom asked her what that was about, my sister said, "Sometimes I have to tell Paris to be a nice person or he can't visit anymore." We moved not too long afterwards, and she didn't get a new playhouse. My son was 2. He started to cry in the middle of the night and say an orange doggy was under his cot. This went on for at least a month. He would describe the orange doggy as having sharp teeth, stealing his dummies, and biting his lips and face until there was blood. He's 16 now and still remembers it vividly. Bit late to the party, but anyway, my mom used to tell me the story about my imaginary friend. Well, to start off, my mom used to come check on me in the morning and things would have been placed into my cot that baby me would have had no way of reaching to put them in myself. Then as I got to maybe 5 years old I complained of someone knocking on my bedroom door each night. Then came the story of my imaginary friend, a little girl that I would play with. My mom asked me describe her, and I said she wore a long dress, had blonde ringlet hair and her eyes were rolled back in her head. Cue freaked out mom. She tried not to bring it up too much as she didn't want to encourage this friend to stick around. But a few months later we were sat in the front room when I started to cry. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her that my friend was sat on her lap and that wasn't fair as I wanted to sit on her lap instead. She never forgave me for the mini heart attack that gave her. Eventually years go by, and I have no recollection of said friend, but my mom would tell the story every so often. Bonus story. Years later when my eldest was old enough to start talking, she would frequently tell me about her other mom who would come to visit her in her dreams, to make sure she was okay, and to say she missed her. My daughter would tell me that sometimes she would want to go with her other mom to wherever she goes when she leaves. F that. Edit. There's quite a few ghost stories from that house that happened well into my early 20s. I struggle to accept the supernatural, but there was a lot of stuff that happened that I just can't explain. Edit 2. Spoke to my daughter about other mom today and she has no recollection of her whatsoever. But something strange she said was, "I think little sister is other mom." She came back to me, which is really odd as imposter B did stop visiting a few months before little one was conceived. My eldest told me that his imaginary friend misses me and wishes he could have been with me longer than a month. I lost his big sister to SIDS a month after she was born, the year before I had him. I have a younger relative who used to talk about her imaginary friend, Miss Mim. Miss Mim looks down on everyone, not because she's arrogant, but because she is always floating high up on the ceiling. Miss Mim is always wearing her favorite white dress and holding a big clear towel, a wedding dress and veil. Miss Mim's neck is always bent. Miss Mim cries a lot. Miss Mim hates our grandma. When we mentioned this to grandma, she told us she had a friend who hanged herself in her wedding dress after her groom left her at the altar. I asked that same relative if she remembers Miss Mim, but all she could recall was that weird crying she heard sometimes. Most of my extended family live around the same area, so we have lots of gatherings. For the backstory, one of my uncles, let's call him Steve, lost a childhood friend when he was 7. Steve and his friend, let's call him Jack, were having a play date one afternoon and got a bit dirty in some mud. So Steve's mother gave Jack a pair of Steve's shoes to borrow. When Jack's father came to pick him up after the play date, they forgot to put back on Jack's shoes and Jack accidentally got into the car with the borrowed shoes still on. Tragically, the father and Jack got into a terrible car crash on the way home which killed 7-year-old Jack. The family had him buried in the shoes he had borrowed from Steve. I'm not sure why. Fast forward 30 years to a family gathering in 2010. My 6-year-old cousin Sarah is playing alone with toys in a quieter room of the house. My uncle Steve comes up to her and asks her what she is playing. Sarah responds saying that she is playing with a friend. Holding back a smile, Steve asks who her imaginary friend is. Sarah continues to play while saying that she is playing with his friend Jack and that he is sorry he forgot to give your shoes back. My uncle's jaw nearly dropped. He had not talked about Jack in years, let alone tell that story to a 6-year-old. No one had brought up Jack that day nor at any family gathering recently. Every time I remember this incident I get chills. I don't know if this would be considered an imaginary friend, but this happened around I was 4/5/6. Don't exactly remember. It was a couple months after my grandfather died because of lung cancer. He used to smoke, and we were living at my grandmother's at the time. One day I was on the couch and my grandmother was talking about her wedding with my grandfather. I ended up saying I was at your wedding. They explained to me I wasn't, and my grandmother asked me questions about it, and I answered every one correct about the marriage. I think this was a week before or after, but on that day I was talking to myself. I usually talk a lot to myself, and I still do. Closed bracket comma. And my mom walked in and asked who I was talking to. My mother told me I responded with him talking to Pap. A couple months passed after these events, and they start re-asking me and told me if I remember talking to my grandfather. I forgot everything. When I was 8, I remember getting ready to school and my grandma was still asleep. This is forever in my mind. I see a white figure the same shape he is, and I saw him walk into the bathroom. That was the last time I saw or talked to him. Not an imaginary friend per se, but my niece as a toddler made a pretty convincing case that she was reincarnated. From the time she could lisp her first words, she carried on about someone called Tertha or Truther or something odd like that. Sometimes she called herself Tertha and a fair number of her dolls had those or similar names. By the time she was 2 or 3, she talked non-stop about her other mommy and her sister and how she, Tertha, and her other mommy and sister were in a car accident and then were in the hospital and her other mommy died. I mean, she wouldn't quit about it. My sister neither discouraged her from telling the stories nor encouraged her. She would always finish up with the punk line, then after my other mommy died, then I was in your stomach. Imagine a little child, big eyes looking up at you, rattling on about this. She pretty much stopped by the time she was 6, and by 8 didn't remember this at all. We figured she had forgotten her reincarnation. When I was 6 I had a friend who was a little younger than me, and her imaginary friend was not a very nice person. She used to tell me how her imaginary friend, Mr. G, made her hurt between her legs, and how he tasted funny and made funny noises. She was absolutely terrified of him. She told me Mr. G was very tall, with no hair, and very mean eyes. After a few sleepovers my mom wouldn't let me have sleepovers at her house anymore, and then she and her mom moved away. Her father didn't go with them. He was a very tall man with no hair and mean eyes. When I was little it was pretty firmly established that I had an imaginary friend named Othera that had the same name as me, so I just called him Other. I would tell my mom that Other was being mean to me and wants to steal dad's bike. I remember I told my father that Other was very mad at him for hurting me. He was an abusive piece of work, and he literally threw me across the room. I asked my mom about it as an adult, and she told me my father had a brother that I was named after and wasn't told about because shortly before I was born he died in a motorcycle accident. This is a daytime reading post. When my cousin and I were kids she casually mentioned she had a friend named Harold who lived in the picture frames. Their entire hallways was lined with picture frames, and she would always hold her breath when she walked by them. Anyway, one day we were hanging out in their unfinished basement and she pointed to a beam in the far back corner and stated very bluntly that that's where Harold sleeps. Context: my bedroom was in the attic when my brother was 4. He told me about the man who lived in the attic. Apparently he would hear someone walking around in the attic when I wasn't in there. He said he'd seen someone's head poking out of the hatch watching him at night, and that he was sorry he'd been too scared to do anything about the man in my bedroom. If that wasn't bad enough, one time I was hanging out in his room one day when he went quiet out of nowhere, and when I asked what was wrong he said he's back, and I swear to God I heard footsteps coming from the attic. I no longer live with them. I was talking to the same brother, now age 10, about him taking the bigger attic bedroom. Now it's empty. My youngest brother, 5, immediately answered, "But where will the man live?" Not my story. I read it in a Mumsnet thread about creepy imaginary friends. Now had a 6-7-year-old lad who had this imaginary friend who started out quite normal, but then began telling the boy he didn't like his mum and dad. The son freely told the mum this, and then was whispering ideas to him about hurting or upsetting his mum and the pets. The Mumsnet decided to not make a big deal out of it, but tried to discourage chat about the IF. She could always tell if her son thought the imaginary friend was there, as he had a certain uncomfortable look at times. Meal times when they were all together etc. Sometimes she would ask, and son would say he's in the hall and won't come in cause you're here. He's told me to try and bite you. Open bracket exclamation mark close bracket. The op would feel watched from the hall. Feel an atmosphere etc. Unbeknownst to her son, upon the advice of a friend, she tried sprinkling salt across doorways, herb cleansing and saying prayers etc. And the whole atmosphere in the house lightened. A couple of days later, while her son was playing happily in the living room, she couldn't stand the suspense anymore and asked his imaginary friend name. "Not here." Son said no. "And I'm a bit glad." Op, trying to keep it light, said, "Well, that's good then." Son said, and this is the bit that gave me the right heebie-jeebies when I first read it, "But he's just out there, and he's watching us through the window." I've mentioned this before, but my sister Ashley used to get visited at night by a dead girl with long dark hair and spider hands. Yes, this predated the Ring. Yes, I'm old AF. She moved out the second she turned 18. Never looked back. 20 odd years later, our half-brother Trevor moved into her old room. It wasn't long after Trev started sleeping on the sofa, or with the lights on, and told us about his new friend that he didn't like. She was a dead girl who had long dark hair, an old nightgown, and spider hands. Needless to say, none of us offered to trade rooms with him. I wouldn't call it an imaginary friend, but growing up I used to think the two grumpy old men from the Muppets, Statler and Waldorf, lived in mirrors. It got to the point where I was deathly afraid of mirrors and would turn them around so I wouldn't see the reflection. I know I creeped my mother out when I told her I did it, so the men in the mirror can't watch me. My coworker's daughter told me that her imaginary friend Lisa said, "Good people die too. You're good. Watch out." My mum told me that when I was younger, maybe 3 to 4, I was looking out the window into the front yard laughing. When she asked me what I was laughing at, I flat out said to her the people dancing outside with no faces. Mum said she just kept looking ahead at the TV and acted as if she had never asked.